I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
My name is Robert Benham. I'm a retired judge and lawyer whose professional career was spent in Memphis, Tennessee. The purpose of this course was to expose people of all ages to the civil rights movement in the South that existed between the years 1955, ending with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. Today we're going to cover two topics. First will be the sit-ins, and second, the Freedom Riders. Last week we ended with Little Rock, the school year 1957-1958, and then the lost year of 1958-1959 when all the schools were closed. We're going to retreat 1 year and we're going to go back to 1958, Nashville, Tennessee, which is somewhat removed from Little Rock. It's here, Nashville is here. Nashville will play a pivotal role today, as will Birmingham and other cities in the South. In 1958, students in Nashville began considering an approach to the elimination of discrimination at eating establishments at the downtown lunch counters. Nashville was probably the epicenter of black educational institutions in the South at that time. It was the home to the American Baptist Theological Seminary, where John Lewis, who we'll hear an awful lot about, matriculated from a small town in South Alabama. It was also home to Fisk University, which was an all-black private school established shortly after the Civil War. It was the first private school for all blacks in the South, on a par with Howard in Washington, Spelman, and Morehouse in Atlanta. It was also the home of Meharry Medical School, which was the first medical school for African Americans in the South. And at the time, a period we're exploring, 83% of the doctors, MDs in the South were graduates of either Meharry or Howard. That's black doctors. It was also the home of Tennessee A&I, now Tennessee State University. But in 1958, a small group of students began meeting with one James Lawson, an African-American graduate student at Vanderbilt's Divinity School. And this is Vanderbilt's publicity of what the school looked like. This is what it looks like when you walk there. Lawson was a very, very interesting character, and we will see him appear in later portions of these presentations. He was an advocate of nonviolence and had studied the teachings of Gandhi in Nagpur, India. Following that, while attending graduate school at Oberlin College in Ohio, he was introduced to Martin Luther King, who encouraged him to come to the South and develop a following based on nonviolence. So Lawson began espousing these principles in Nashville to black students or African American students at the then segregated black colleges and universities located in that city. Lawson began what I would call sensitivity training by exposing students to the type of confrontation they could expect in desegregating facilities. They called each other the N-word and practiced dehumanization on each other. This was both verbal and physical. Now, November 28, 1959, a number of these students went to downtown Nashville, entered Harvey's, which was the largest department store in Nashville, purchased items, and then went to the lunch counter where service was denied. The students left. On December 5th of 1959, this was repeated at Kane Sloan, the second of Nashville's leading department stores, with the same result. And could this, in fact, be considered the first sit-in? That's kind of open to debate. While students were continuing to be trained in Nashville for what would be the sit-ins that garnered national publicity, on February 1st, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Ezell A. Blair Jr., Franklin E. McLean, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, entered the Woolworth 5 and Dime, were denied service, and remained seated at the lunch counter until the store closed. Historically, this is widely recognized as the first sit-in, despite what had occurred in Nashville the prior December. On the next day, February 2nd, McNeil and McCain were joined by William Smith and Clarence Henderson at the Woolworth lunch counter. And one of the exhibits at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, they've got an exact replica of the lunch counter in Greensboro. The reaction of management was, close the fountain. Subsequently, and on successive days, the third day, the 4 were joined by 20, then 60, then 300, and the Greensboro sit-ins were followed by boycotts. And in July of 1960, the lunch counter at Woolworth's was integrated. Now, I say integrated. In actuality, the manager of the Greensboro Woolworths got several of his black employees to take off their work clothes. He dressed them up, then sent them to the lunch counter, and they were the first blacks to be served. The movement spread to other cities in the South, but the one in Nashville received the lion's share of national attention. These publicized sit-ins began either on February 7th or 13th, and there's conflicting evidence as to which date. And frankly, even though I was in school at that time, it was highly publicized. I just don't remember, because Nashville downtown was off limits to Vanderbilt students. By off limits, once the violence broke out for the East Nashville Roughnecks, it was not really safe, inasmuch as the police were pretty much hands-off, and the expression is, I think, to allow nature to take its course, but it wasn't nature. It was to allow violence to take its course, and it just continued on and on. On the first day of the sit-ins, the students went to lunch counters at Woolworth's, Cress's, McClellan's, and W.T. Grant. They were orderly, well-dressed, and remained at their seats until 6 p.m. when the stores closed, and then they left. They were verbally abused, but there was no physical abuse that day. On February 18th and 19th, hundreds of students showed up to sit in, and written instructions had to be handed out because they did not have time to orient the students. And these written instructions that we have in front of you: do not strike back or curse if abused. Do not laugh out. Do not hold conversations with floor walker. Do not leave your seat until your leader has given you permission. Do not block entrances to stores outside of the aisles or the aisles inside. And we've seen a lot of blockaging in the news from Canada this past week, and that is not something the authorities look upon with favor. Do show yourself friendly and courteous at all times. Do sit straight, always face the counter. Do report all serious incidents to your leader. Do refer information seekers to your leader in a polite manner. And do remember the teachings of Jesus Christ, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Love and nonviolence is the way. There's a bit of uncertainty as to who wrote that, but in John Meacham's book that George Frakes was so gracious as to lend to me, in which I started reading yesterday, that book indicates that this may have been written by John Lewis. The sit-ins continued, and here we see Julian Bond and Diane Nat, Julian Bond leading a group of protesters, And here is Diane Nash, and to her right, our left, is C.T. Vivian, a instrumental person in the civil rights movement that we'll hear a lot about when we get to the Selma portion of the presentation. Diane Nash was one of the pioneers in the movement in Nashville at this time and even later. There was a different story on February 27th, known as Big Saturday. That morning, one Will Campbell, a white minister who had been run out of town in Oxford, Mississippi, home of the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, for playing ping pong with a black man, and he addressed a core of the protesting students, warning of possible violence and the lack of police protection. Despite these warnings, the groups of students again marched to downtown Nashville and began their sit-ins at lunch counters. And this is the group that goes on Big Sunday, and as you can see, it is a huge, huge group of people. Assaults and beatings ensued, more pictures of stuff from the lunch counters, ketchup, mustard being poured on students. You see a lot of people with cigarettes, and they also burned students with cigarettes. It was quite a conflagration. Finally, the police, this is an incident, another incident we can see, and outside the Crystal, which is adjacent to some of the five and dime stores, you see people being beaten. And what did the police do? The police arrived and they arrested 81 black protesters and 0 white agitators. Who did they arrest? Well, this is John Lewis. The black students were charged with disorderly conduct, and rather than post bail, which was reduced to $5, all remained in jail until the jail was full in Nashville, and at 11 p.m. they got released. Meanwhile, the seats vacated by the arrested students were quickly occupied by others. And again, you see John Lewis being carted off. This is what he called good trouble. And this is his initial mugshot. There were many, many after this. On Sunday, February 28th, Stephen Wright, then the president of Fisk University, addressed over 1,000 students that were in that university's chapel, praised the students, and was the first high-ranking educator to do so. Meanwhile, across town, Harvey Branscombe, the chancellor at Vanderbilt, took steps in all due haste, resulting in the expulsion of James Lawson. And why was he expelled? Because what was he teaching? Nonviolence. This is the old-fashioned blackboard, education, negotiation, direct action, follow-up. And to a great extent, this is Lawson being expelled and then arrested, and this was promoted by one of the Vanderbilt trustees, James Stallman, editor of the evening paper, the Nashville Banner, and the paper firmly anti-integration. The Vanderbilt faculty voiced their protest at this action, but they were overridden by the Board of Trustees. As I often say, follow the money, because the trustees are trustees because they're big donors or they know big donors. And that goes with most 501c3 organizations. The dean of the Divinity School, Robert Nelson, resigned, along with a number of the faculty members, and the American Association of Theological Studies placed the Divinity School on 1-year probation. This is what Vanderbilt School of Divinity preaches, and what do they practice? Going into the school, if you go in, and I took courses there because I enjoy studying religion, this is what you see published in the school. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. That's not what they practiced. What did they do? They expelled these people. So be it, for when politics and money get in the way of religion. On Monday, February 29th, was court day. On that day, one Z. Alexander Luby, a black lawyer of great renown, appeared pro bono to represent the students. Luby was the first black person to be elected to the Nashville City Council and was an excellent, excellent lawyer and proved later to be an icon in the civil rights movement. The judge summarily, here is Luby, I think this is Diane Nash, this is the appearance in the city court, and the judge found all the defendants guilty. We've got Luby, and I can't recall the name of this gentleman who's also a lawyer in Nashville. This is Diane Nash, this is John Lewis, and they were ordered to pay a fine of $50 each, and they were sentenced to 30 days in the county workhouse. This prompted national outrage across the country, and many notables such as Ralph Bunche, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Harry Belafonte joined the fray. And this is what you see today after the fact, and you see these markers throughout the South, and let's just read it. On 15 February 1960, 124 students from Nashville's historically black colleges and universities walked into Woolworth's, Cress's, and McClellan's, sat down at the lunch counters, and asked to be served to no avail. The students also targeted Walgreens, W.T. Grant, as well as Harvey's and Kane Sloan department stores. Their goal was to desegregate Nashville lunch counters. The student protesters experienced no violence until February 27. On that day at Woolworth's and McClellan's, white resistors threw the students from their seats, punched, kicked, and spat upon them. Nashville police only arrested the student protesters. 81 students were arrested and charged with loitering and disorderly conduct. 2 days later, the court fined each student $50. They took a principal stand, refused to pay the bill, and spent 33 1/3, I don't know where the 1/3 came from, days in jail. But you see these markers throughout the South today. It's a far cry from what was going on in 1960. With all the negative publicity, the mayor, Ben West, ordered the release of the students. Now, to the lawyers in the audience, I don't know how a mayor can order the release of students who have been confined by a judge, but he did it, and they were released. So this is a slide of West, Reverend Vivian, and Diane Nash. Protests resumed by Friday, March 25th, and by that time, national publicity calls the governor, Buford Ellington, to be irate but not ready to act. Then came the boycott of downtown stores by the African American community and their white supporters. Now, this is right before Easter, and Easter is the big marketplace for shoes and for clothing, or at least was in the South. And I know my last year in high school, I had a job on Saturdays selling shoes, and that was the day that we sold the most shoes, more so than Christmas, more so than any other time. So that was a big deal. And once you do an economic boycott, then you get the attention of people. The mayor formed a committee to try to mediate the lunch counter matter, and then came up with a report, or should I say a plan, And what was the plan? It was the plan to divide the lunch counters into two sections, one for white patrons and one for black patrons, just like on the buses. Well, students didn't buy in. Sit-ins and the boycott intensified. Then on April 19th, in the time-honored Southern tradition, dynamite is thrown into the home of Z. Alexander Luby. We saw it last week, we see it this week, we're going to see it every week. This is the way that the Ku Klux Klan and their Confederates reacted to integration. Just blow it up. He and his wife were not injured, but their home was destroyed. This caused community-wide outrage, and over 4,000 citizens marched on City Hall, where Mayor West agreed that discrimination was wrong and urged stores and managers to desegregate their lunch counters. And again, here we have a marker at the Luby home with the Luby family. Approximately 3,000 civil rights activists, including many students from the city's 4 black colleges and universities, marched on the Davidson County Courthouse. By June, the 7 downtown Nashville stores originally targeted with sit-ins and other protests desegregated their lunch counters. Concerns over the bombing of the Luby residents and the economic boycott helped achieve that result. Over the next years, sit-ins continued throughout the country, and controversy was a word of the day until passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, as it is said in the South, we'll get to directly. Now, it's really, really interesting throughout all of this, and you see what happened to Jim Lawson. But July 27, 2021, that's just last July. That's not long ago. And this is from something I received from Vanderbilt. More than 4 decades after Vanderbilt University expelled Reverend James Lawson for his involvement in the civil rights movement, the private Nashville University has decided to honor the civil rights stalwart with the creation of the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements at Vanderbilt University. And this is what the chancellor says. During these deeply polarizing times, the Reverend James Lawson continues to lead us on a path toward a more just world through an enduring message of compassion and redemption. As he has taught throughout his career, there can be no meaningful change and progress, no bridging the divide in our nation without reconciliation and forgiveness. I am excited to see the impact of this new institute on our community, especially the opportunities it will create for constructive discourse, as well as the lessons in leadership it will provide our students. Lawson, after being expelled from Vanderbilt, moved to Memphis, where he was pastor in a church and was very instrumental in many of the matters that I'll present on week 6. Subsequently, he moved to Los Angeles and is still active to some extent in Los Angeles today. He's in his 90s. Let's take a break because, as I said, I think our next section is going to take much longer than our first section. Thank you.